We asked our audience what was concerning them the most and how they basically feel about politics. And it was a bit grim, the responses. So 89% said they didn't feel inspired and 93% said they didn't feel represented. Why do you think so many people don't feel like they belong or necessarily care about Australian politics?
Yeah, I'm not surprised by those numbers, and I'm also not surprised that that's how people feel, because as someone that's kind of inside the bubble now, I feel the same way. It's very easy to feel depressed and hopeless and helpless, because I mean, you look at all the things that are happening around the world and in the country at the moment. What I really put it down to, and from like how I feel and my friendship circle, and from chatting to, like, I have like the second youngest electorate in the whole country. So from just talking to people in the electorate, the general vibe that I get is everything's broken. I don't think anyone in power is going to fix it. And I feel like we're kind of in this sort of stalemate position at the moment. And I feel like because we're not seeing government take climate change seriously, we're not seeing them do any sort of huge systemic reform on housing or on higher education or in mental health or in anything like that, that what I think is happening is that what I would call the social contract, so like the unspoken agreement that we have between ourselves and society, that, oh, if I just work hard, everything will be fine, and I will be able to afford a house, and I will be able to do all the things that I want to do, that's pretty much broken down. And so that's why I think so many young people feel so despondent, is because, well, even if I do work hard, even if I do get a job and get like, you know, medium levels of success, that's actually never going to be enough. Because I think I remember reading this stat that said something like, at the moment, if you're like just coming out of high school now, it's going to take you 41 years to save for a deposit on a house. So then immediately you're so far on the back foot that you just feel like, what's the point? And so when that happens, that's when we see those stats, like you just mentioned, is people feeling like politics is uninspiring and it is kind of pointless. And so I find part of my job is to try and push through that in my head and try and present some sort of hope for people that things can be better, because a lot of the time they are already better overseas and we're just getting the bum end of the deal here in Australia.
I totally agree with when I speak to my friends and we're just trying to live. So many conversations now are geared towards, oh, I actually can't afford that. Or it's not even, especially with, I guess, home ownership, it's something that so many of my friends and even me don't believe it's ever going to happen, because it's such a faraway dream. And then on top of that, the rental crisis and cost of living crisis and every other crisis coming at us, it does feel really hard to feel like you can even put a step forward in your life, let alone want to engage in something that is meant to help you and doesn't. You actually recently criticized the Treasurer for making a comment about telling more young people to have babies when we're already struggling to even take care of ourselves, let alone take care of a whole child. Why was that so, I suppose, why did that strike a chord with you?
It was just, I remember seeing that article, I can't remember who reported it, but it was just such an eye roll. That was like, wow, you really just have no idea, do you? Like, why do you think no one's having kids? Like, we have created a society that doesn't encourage people to have kids because it's so expensive. People are feeling depressed and hopeless. And so why would you want to bring another person into that world? And I'm just like, if you actually are serious about quote unquote family values and actually wanting people to feel safe and secure enough to actually have kids, you need to be making childcare universal. You need to be wiping people's student debt. You need to be making higher education free. You need to be getting off coal and gas. You actually need to be creating a future that is exciting and that people want. This feels so kind of morbid, but that people want to live to see, and that people want their kids to be able to grow up in. And I think I remember seeing this stat, this is a few years ago now, so I don't know if it's the most sort of up-to-date information, but it's a problem that's happening right across the West, where government officials are just like, have babies. That'll fix everything. The birth rate's so low. We're freaking out. But they're not doing anything systemic to actually address that. And I remember reading there were only a handful of countries that were actually seeing positive birth rates, and that was the Scandinavian ones. And that was because they basically put it down to free childcare, extremely excellent paternal and maternal leave, just parental leave, and an amazing education system and trust in government institutions. And so that combination basically created a system or society where people thought, okay, I feel comfortable, things are going well for me. Yeah, I'll have kids, I'll have a family. I can afford to actually do that now.
Yeah, it does feel a bit like we're just watching all this unfold around us and we're like, how are we actually meant to exist in this ecosystem when it's so stacked against us? And that's kind of what a lot of our audience was saying and what a lot of them feel. And even going further than that as well, on top of, the cost of living crisis and everything else, there's a really big issue with a lot of young queer and trans and diverse people feeling very unsafe. And especially with the rhetoric that comes globally, but then is infecting its way into Australia. What are sort of the main concerns you've heard that a lot of younger queer and trans and diverse people are feeling?
On a personal level and from hearing from other people, it's the fear of the importation of the US style culture war and also just the US policies that are now coming out, like banning drag queens effectively and doing things like that, and don't say gay bills like you have in Florida now. I think it's the fear of what could come, and I think we're already seeing the LNP especially buy into that and think, oh, it worked for Trump, maybe it'll work for us if we start doing that as well. I don't think we're at the same level as the United States yet, but I think it's our responsibility as the Greens and as progressive members of parliament in this place is to stop that before it even gets in here. So like when we're looking at some of our policies, like bringing gender affirming healthcare into Medicare and sort of just normalizing it, for lack of a better phrase, for people in the community that, oh, this is just another aspect of healthcare that people get access to. That's really nice. Then you see things like was it last week, I think, or it was last week, the book ban that happened in the council in Sydney. And that's terrifying because the fact that a politician can even decide what people are reading or what people have the ability to read is scary in and of itself. And so, I think there are opportunities that we have. I think the upcoming, if it is upcoming, the religious discrimination bill, you can in this country at the moment be fired from a job because you are queer. You can be fired from a job if you get divorced while at work. You can be fired from a job because you become a single mom while you're at work. People don't really realize that actually happens in this country in 2024. And so there is an opportunity there for us to increase protections and make sure that people's human rights are respected. Something we've also been pushing for in the federal parliament is a LGBTIQA plus human rights commissioner. We have the sex discrimination commissioner, and the former sex discrimination commissioner even said, we need that role because there's so much that needs to be done and there's so much that needs to be monitored, really, because you may win your rights in the short to medium term, but anyone in a minority group will relate to this, that they're never a given. They can always be taken away again. And so we need a commissioner like that whose sole focus is to make sure that queer rights across the country are being protected across all jurisdictions, not just in the federal government. But I think I am hopeful for the future. I think that, everything is always an uphill battle, unfortunately, but we've gotten up the hill multiple times before, and I don't see why we can't do it again this time.
Yeah, I mean, that's an inspiring nugget to take away. But
there has to be something.
Yeah, but even I was actually going to ask about the Cumberland Council's book banning because speaking of that sort of imported strain of just anti-queerness from the US especially, it can be hard to sort of look at that and think, oh, that's just in the US when you look around here and as you said, the Liberal Party are increasingly becoming more down that line, especially trying to ban trans kids in sports and from schools and outing them and all this other sorts of awful stuff. But as it stands now, what do you make of the current levels of access for trans and gender affirming healthcare in Australia?
It obviously could be a lot better. I think, like I was talking about, our biggest push is to get gender affirming healthcare into Medicare because it's basically one thing to have doctors in the country that can provide that healthcare, but it's a whole other question whether or not people can access that healthcare. And I think it's part of our role as politicians and people in this place is to make sure that when we say universal healthcare, that means universal. That means, I would say, free at the point of use. And I think that is something that we should be striving towards, not just in queer healthcare, but in healthcare more broadly. So I think that, yeah, that's something that we have been pushing for a long, long time, and something that we will keep pushing for.
There's also obviously a lot of talk about the epidemic of violence against women. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of concerns that many trans women are often left out of the conversations about that. And especially when trans women go missing globally, but in Australia as well, that their cases aren't as investigated or heard as much. How can the nation, I suppose, better address trans women's safety and include it as part of the women's push to help women?
Yeah, that's a good question. And because, yeah, like you said, the violence that trans women face is extreme and horrific. And I think part of our role in addressing that is, broadening out the conversation to include trans people in that discussion. And I think as well, all queer people in that discussion. We do experience higher rates of mental illness, and we do experience higher rates of violence more generally as well. And I think it's important to have those nuances in the conversation, because if we're not actually doing that, then, like you said, no one's gonna care, really. And I think it's also about making sure that, when we do have, I think about this example in New South Wales, where they had this this report that was handed down into the police force in New South Wales that basically said, you ignored queer hate crimes for years and years and years. Do the following things, but please don't just do an empty apology. And so the one thing they did was offer an apology and didn't actually address the systemic issues. I think a lot of the times in these scenarios, and it's the same with domestic violence, is there are already solutions that have been presented to governments, often multiple times, and they just get completely ignored. So to answer your question, there is already the expertise and the solutions that are out there that have already been presented to different parliaments across the country. It's actually just pressuring the government to do something about it. In the budget last night, we literally had, the government basically said they wanted to establish this 10-year LGBTIQA plus health and wellbeing plan, which would include things like this, allegedly. No mention of it since then. No money for it, no anything for it. And we've basically been fobbed off saying, oh, that'll be included in the plan. That'll be included in the plan. Oh, this concern you've brought to us, that will be included in the plan. Don't worry about it. It's all going to be in the plan. And now there's seemingly no plan anymore. And so I feel like if we're not in here pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing, and there aren't more queer people in politics doing that, then I think the government's just not going to do anything about it. And so if anyone is watching this and is queer and wants to get in politics, it's awful, but you need to do it.
Well, even on that, I suppose, without having that representation, and from your experience, have you seen a correlation between when there's no one pushing for that to link back to real examples of homophobia and violence in the real world? Even with the recent spate of homophobic slurs being thrown around the AFL and in sporting, and just a culture of unsafe spaces for a lot of queer people. How have you seen that sort of come alive? And then also, how do you think we can change the culture to be more inclusive for queer people?
Yeah, I think definitely in this place, if we weren't here, I think it would happen a lot more. I honestly think, without sounding obnoxious, that me being in the House of Representatives as a very openly gay man tempers things, and the people that may think things will never actually say them because there's the personification of it sort of sitting near them. And I think that does help a little bit. The Senate's a whole other issue. But I think even if we didn't have progressive people and Green senators who will vehemently speak out against that, and if a motion does come forward that's terrible, which does fairly frequently happen, usually we'll get sort of one every couple of sitting weeks. One of the cookers will bowl something up. If we didn't have people in there who were immediately going to try and shut it down and just publicly back in the queer community, it would happen so much more often. And I think that seeps out into broader society as well. So if you do have things that are happening in the AFL, and you do have people saying homophobic slurs or doing whatever it may be, we need people in public positions of leadership to be actively calling that out and saying, oh, that's actually not cool. That's not okay to do that. Because if there's no voices doing that, then it becomes acceptable to do that. Yeah, like you were alluding to a bit earlier, like these things are never, they never happen suddenly. Like I lived in Florida for a little bit before it went off the deep end. But it was, you could feel it building. This is in 2012, 2013, 2014. Like the state had like just voted for Obama. Like they had a Democratic governor, I'm pretty sure. Like it was deemed more of a quote unquote progressive place to be. But the rumblings were sort of starting to begin, and the government there was very sort of, oh, we won't deal with that. We don't want culture wars. We're so scared of any form of backlash from anyone that we'll just be quiet and everything will be fine. And now, 10 years later, look where they are now. So I think it's one thing to not want to be involved in quote-unquote culture wars, but I think at the same time, we have a responsibility to actually stand up and defend our community, because if we don't do it, I don't know who else is going to.
Yeah, and switching gears a bit, the government announced that they were wiping $3 billion of HEX, and then they'll only index it at the lower level of, I believe it was the wage or the inflation. Were you happy with that?
My gut reaction to it was, I was surprised, honestly, that they did anything, because I spent the best part of last year annoying the education minister in question time saying, hey, because people reach out to me a lot about this issue in the electorate and across the country. And so asking, hey, this is a really big issue. That 7.8% indexation, you could see it coming from a mile off that this was about to happen. Are you going to do anything? Why won't you wipe the indexation? Why won't you wipe student debt? Or even like bits of it? Because like even America has wiped bits of student debt. And just met with a constant like, oh, that's not a priority. That's not a priority. That doesn't actually help anyone. It's not really going to do anything for anyone in a cost of living crisis. And so now to see them sort of turn around and say, oh, actually, maybe it will help people was surprising. They went about as far as I would ever expect the Labour Party to go, the current Labour Party to go, which was basically apply a Band-Aid to it. So obviously I would like to see, and the Greens would like to see, student debt be wiped entirely. You shouldn't have to pay for education. And I think that's becoming, it should be, I think, for the government, becoming clearer and clearer. They're just talking about now they want, I think it's way over 50% of the workforce to have a tertiary education. And so if we're starting to see tertiary education as fundamental to existence in society as primary and secondary education, well, then we should be making tertiary education free. If you want people to be able to access it, you have to remove that barrier. We basically have to create a society where people can choose the paths that they want to go down without fear of financial penalty for doing so. And so even though they've done this little change to the indexation, people are still going to leave uni with tens of thousands of dollars of HEX debt. It just might not inflate at the same speed that it was before.
I mean, we even did a research as well into unpaid placements and things like that, and how that was ruining a lot of students' lives, and it ruins my friends' lives. But a lot of people feel with HEX is one, why is it being indexed in the first place? But two, there's a lot of frustration with how that money is used and how much money the government makes off our loans and our debts, especially when that money seems to go towards fossil fuels or weapons manufacturing. I suppose, how do we assure people that their money's being well spent? And how do we like hold the government accountable to use our money, especially from our like education debt, wisely? Yeah,
that's the $1 million question, isn't it? Like, obviously I'm going to say support Greens politicians. But I think as well there's space for like civil society as well. Like, protesting, getting involved in community organizing and grassroots activism, because really that's been the most effective method of change throughout history. Like, huge changes like that have never just been the government did it because they felt like it was a nice thing to do for people. Like, women didn't just get the vote. Like, it came from people, in a lot of cases, sacrificing themselves in order to do that. And so I think, and I'm not saying that people need to throw themselves in front of horse and buggies for HEX step, but like, getting involved in activism in grassroots organizations, in community building, is a really, really effective way to create change like that. I think when we have a two-party system at the moment, you're pretty much guaranteed that your tax money is going to be spent on terrible things, on weapons manufacturing, on $14.5 billion this year in fossil fuel subsidies. Like, that is going to happen because that is who they are bought and paid for. And I think that is only going to break if we smash the two-party system in this country. There is no other way around that. And I think we do that by organising, by getting out there, by getting active, and then by volunteering for politicians that you want to see in this place. Because I think there definitely is that space to work outside of the system, but there's also a role for working inside of the system as well in trying to affect the legislative change that we really, really want to see to try and make things better for everyday people. And so, yeah, like I said earlier, it's a very uphill battle, but it's a fight worth having. And yeah, because it has the possibility of leading to so many positive things. And I think if people just sort of allow themselves to get wrapped up in the despondency and in the despair, then that works so well for the two major parties, because they don't want people to think that a better world is possible, because then that means they have to actually pull their finger out and try and create that better world. If people like look around the world at positive things that are happening, like so many countries offer free higher education. There are so many countries that are already nearly at 100% renewables. There are so many examples of, oh wow, it's better over there, or someone is living a better life over there. Why should we in Australia accept that? You know, a better world is possible. It exists already. We should be striving towards it. And for every politician that says, oh no, you're being ridiculous, you're being too idealistic, there's no way we could possibly do that, it just means they don't want to. In short, there's no other reason why they wouldn't be doing that. It's just that they don't want to do it.
I mean, you mentioned a bit earlier about getting people active and getting out there and having their voices heard. And I think that there's a lot of discussion, especially from the government, about the student encampments in universities across Australia and globally. But a lot of them are advocating for divestment from the university organizations away from Israel manufacturing companies. And there was a comment that Prime Minister Albanese made saying that the students chanting from the river to the sea wouldn't be able to locate Jordan on a map. I suppose, what do you think of that, and also that sort of belittling of the students who are there and who are trying to bring light to a better world?
I think you summed it up perfectly when you said belittling. Like, it is belittling. This is someone who spent the better part of his political career advocating for Palestine, and now that he has the ability to do anything about it, has just completely capitulated on everything. And it's fascinating to watch it happen in real time in the chamber, and as equally devastating to watch it happen in real time. I think it feeds into that broader narrative we were just talking about of crush their hope, crush it. Because if they think that they're going to get what they want, which is a better, fairer, more equitable world, then they're going to keep protesting. And that's not what the government wants people to do. They would rather that everyone just, lives in their little box and goes to work, comes home and consumes things through online shopping, because that's what capitalism requires you to do. And that's what they want you to do. And I think it's important to push back against that narrative that young people don't know what they're doing, which is effectively what it comes down to. And like, I've even experienced that in this place. I've been giving a speech in the chamber and I've had someone yell at me across the room, quit and come back when you're older. Like, that's like that's what these people think of pretty much everyone in the country. I would say under 40, really, is that everyone that is young doesn't know what they're on about, that they don't understand the world, and that they're all just stupid. And I think that's where the Prime Minister's comments kind of come from, is that underlying, even if it's subconscious, belief about young people. And I think what we try to get across to people is, no, young people actually do understand how the world works, and they hate it, and that's why they're doing what they're doing, and justifiably so.
Sorry that you've had people yell at you or come across the thing.
I just stare at them like, really? Like, what's wrong with you?
But we've even sort of experienced that when, we mentioned the school strikes for climate, and we were there on the ground in Sydney with a lot of the young kids, and they were walking around, and it was really inspiring to see so many primary school kids involved in it as well as high school, as well as university. A lot of my friends were there. But when I sort of brought that up, Chris Bowen had said that he didn't really think they did much, and that the protesters didn't do much, and that, it didn't matter what they said because he knew what he was doing anyways. He didn't need protesters to tell them what to do, especially young people. I suppose, what do you make of those comments? And do you think that the protesting of the government and us sort of lobbying the government to do better is helping?
Yes. Because if it wasn't helping, they would tell you to protest. I think the fact that they're saying, oh no, it did nothing, it didn't influence me, I am amazing and don't worry about anything, I have everything under control, really tells you all that you need to know, which is that protests were effective. And that I think part of protests and that sort of activism is actually goes beyond trying to just lobby government to do things. I think it's about creating a broader buy-in from society at large, because every time there are those school strike for climates, it's in the news. Because, well, sometimes the mainstream media loves to just be like, boo, children are having opinions. But every time that happens, it's mentioning climate change. It's bringing it into the public consciousness, and it's making people, I mean, I'm sure everyone's aware of it, but it's making people think, oh, wow, this is getting bigger and bigger, and more people seem to be caring about it. Maybe I should also be caring about it. And I think that's kind of really what led to the election we had in 2022. Like, in any other election year, Labor should have romped that home. They should have won 90 seats in the House of Representatives because of how angry everyone was at ScoMo and how angry everyone was at the Liberals. And they scraped in with a 1-seat majority. Like, because people were so mobilized and so motivated by things like the school strike for climate that they thought, oh, wow, actually maybe a better world is possible and I don't have to settle for the polished turd over the gross one. Like, and so I think that's why we saw the Greens win so many seats and the Independents win so many seats, because of that pressure that had built on the ground against the government, but also had created buy-in for so many people, a broad spectrum of people across the community. Like, I remember door knocking on the campaign trail, and people that if you were judging a book by its cover, you would have been like, there's no way this person's going to care about that. They would say, even if they were, and it would be a lot of people's grandparents would be like, I'm probably not going to live to see the worst impacts of this, so it doesn't really affect me, but looking at my grandkids, looking at my kids, like, that's the future and I don't want to wreck it for them. So I think that, yeah, school strike movements like that, yeah, especially create legitimacy, and they make it real for people. And like, even though it might be primary school kids who can't vote, they're creating buy-in for their parents and for their grandparents and their families more broadly, which is really, really important.
I'm curious to get your perspective on how we get those passionate people that are on the ground protesting and those younger primary school kids eventually into this building and into Parliament. And when we went and asked some university students how they felt about politics and if they would ever want to kind of join it, someone made a really interesting point with that they couldn't afford it because they couldn't afford to run a campaign because they're renting and they have HECS debts and they have to afford groceries and everything else. I guess I want to know how you suggest we do that and get more impassioned people, and that me and my friends can feel hopeful that we have people in Parliament that look like us, that speak like us, that are essentially us. And kind of have that hope to keep going, because as you were saying earlier, it's hard to have that, especially when the government's like smash it away. How do we get that to happen?
Oh, that's a big question.
Sorry to end it on that.
No, because it's like so existential. And I'm kind of like thinking about like when I was running, because I still rent the place I live in. And I was renting, working full time in retail, and had my HECS debt. And it's obviously way worse now with the rental crisis and just cost of living in general. But For me, I think the thing that motivated me was a combination of a sort of don't let the bastards win and don't let them get you down versus the experience that made me interested in politics. And I think those are the moments that you have to really, really hold on to. And so I had a moment while I was living in the States where I was working at the quote unquote happiest place on earth at Disney World and had an experience where I walked into the stockroom and one of my coworkers was on the floor crying because she was having to decide insulin or rent. And for me, I had never been political really at all throughout my whole life. And in that moment, it was like, oh my God, how has this happened? And so holding on, I think everyone has an experience like that. And it's about taking that experience, holding on to it for dear life and using that as the motivation. Because I'm not gonna lie, it's very hard for running for office, and it is time consuming and it takes a lot of resources. And I think there's questions around there maybe about like publicly financed campaigns and things that we could get into, but I think it's really about finding your passion and running with it. And I joined the Greens because they were the most closely aligned with my values, and I found it to be really welcoming. The fact that someone like me, like I was 29 or 28 when I put my hand up to run, working in retail at an Apple store in North Brisbane, and they were like, oh yeah, cool. Like it wasn't a dismissal of, oh, you're young, you're stupid, you don't know what you're doing. It was like, oh yeah, no, you seem passionate and somewhat intelligent. And so I guess then, yeah, you should do this. And I found it to be a really, really supporting and supportive experience, which was really, really awesome. Obviously not going to be the same for every single person that does it, but I think if you don't at least give it a go, you're never going to know if you succeed, or you're never going to be able to succeed. Like, even looking back now, I think like, oh my God, like 2 years ago, I was working in an Apple store and now I'm sitting in the House of Representatives. Like, that is wild that can happen to someone. But I think it needs to happen to more people, because without people from all those walks of life, things are never going to change. I think, like, what is it? The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting something different. If everyone just votes for the exact same type of person, but from the red team instead of the blue team, and expects systemic change, that's never going to happen. So we need younger people in this place. We need queer people in this place. We need people from all kinds of backgrounds. We need working class people in this place, because without those voices at the table, nothing will ever change legislatively in this place.
What do you hope then for those people who do come into politics, and for younger people, working class people, queer people? What do you hope for them and for their experience in the future to be here? Now that people like you are here and kicking the door down and letting it be possible for that to happen, but what do you hope for them in the future?
I hope it's easier for them for two things. I hope it's easier for them to get involved in politics and run successful campaigns and be more accepted, quote unquote, as a viable candidate, because people are breaking that mold of what is a viable candidate and what does an MP look like. The other point is something that I really try and drive home for people is seeing being an MP or a senator as a way of helping people. Because I think when someone says, oh, I want a job that helps people, you think, oh, teacher, nurse, doctor, whatever. No one would ever say politician. And I think that's what we need to try and fix. Because for me, in that moment, looking at my coworker on the floor in tears, I was like, I need to be able to help her. I could give her some of my money now. That's going to help her for 3 weeks. Then we're back in this scenario. I want to be able to help her in a capacity where I've changed the system so that she is not in that situation ever again. And I think that that's really, really what I want to try and drive home for people, is that it is a way to help people. And even though it's extremely frustrating and you're never going to be able to do everything you want to, there are people you can help at the individual level. Like, we do a lot of advocacy in my office. We've helped thousands of people now, like, get food or get NDIS or into Centrelink or housing or whatever it might be. But then coming down here and fighting for the systemic changes so that people are not in that position where they have to email their MP asking for groceries because the cost of living crisis is so fucked. that is those are the kind of people that we need in this place. People that want to help people at the individual level and at the systemic level.